Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted, and welcome back to part B of our lecture regarding the Roaring Twenties. So we left off talking about this third space, and we talked about things like pool halls and baseball leagues and teams and the Fiestas Patrias, and of course, music, both the big band and jazz era, and of course, the urban corrido. We're going to pick up right there and discuss one more part of this third space, part of this cultural explosion of the 1920s, and that is an artistic explosion, which I understand, technically speaking, music is part of that. But I want to go beyond the music and talk about performance arts. We talked about the Teatro Hidalgo earlier, but visual arts. This is an era of cultural renaissance, both, of course, for African Americans and for Mexicanos. And let's start with mentioning the Harlem Renaissance, with people like Zora Neale Hurston. In this era, most U.S. history courses focus on Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, and the Harlem Renaissance. A brief period in Harlem, considered to be the capital of artistic expression, as the idea that Blackness was good, celebrating a Black historical culture, was considered a positive thing. You start to see the expansion of, the written word, of artistic expression via paintings. And we start seeing it's not, and again, U.S. history courses are survey courses by nature, and they can't tell everything. But they often get stuck on the Harlem Renaissance, which is a wonderfully beautiful artistic era. But during this era, Mexicanos also would experience an artistic explosion. And in this era, it was largely the work of the muralistas, including David Alfaro Siqueiros, Jose Clemente Orozco, and of course, the ever famous Diego Rivera. And again, I'm going to give honorable mention, of course, to his wife, Frida Kahlo, whose influence cannot be underestimated. And again, her artistic, while she's been more appreciated seemingly since then, she was not a muralista in the traditional sense. She was an artist, yes. But I want to focus on these three muralistas, because following a decade of revolution, Mexico, we talked about, trying to promote Lo Mexicano abroad, right? And trying to promote Mexican nationalism. Mexico desired to use the arts to illustrate Mexican pride, just like they did with the Fiestas Patrias. And in the 1920s, the new government that took over Mexico commissioned a large number of public works of art, which would promote and support the values fundamental to the revolution and to help establish a new identity for Mexico. This identity was based on Mexico's rich historical traditions, as well as a sense of moving forward into the modern age. Importantly, because most Mexicans at this time were illiterate, and promoting the new government's message could not be accomplished through traditional media sources like pamphlets and newspapers. So instead, the government began to communicate their cause through these large-scale murals in public places that could be seen by the thousands. And these three men became leaders of the muralista movement in Mexico and became internationally known as Los Tres Grandes, or the Big Three. Rivera, however, becomes the most famous of all these three as far as modern-day remembrances. He would incorporate European modernism and elements of Cubism into his work, combined with Mexico's bright colors to depict his people, particularly the working class, as being both noble and glorious. And he's not promoting the elites of society, he's promoting the working class. By the 1920s, the influence of Mexican muralism began to spread, particularly into the United States. After gaining success and recognition in Mexico, all three of Los Tres Grandes would spend considerable time in the United States. This was partly because cracks were beginning to show in the idealism that was popularly being expressed in Mexico immediately after the Mexican Revolution. The words and actions of the government no longer seemed to align precisely with that of the artists. And while the initial period of Mexican muralism was characterized by the artists' freedom to express themselves, that freedom was now being cracked down upon by the Mexican government because the government wanted to control the subjects that were depicted in the murals. In other words, they were no longer having artistic license or artistic freedoms. So all three of these men would eventually go to the United States and elsewhere to continue their artistic freedoms. They begin to bring that stylings and ideals into the United States. For instance, Alfredo Sequeiros, he was exiled from Mexico by 1932, moving to Los Angeles where he'll paint several well-known murals. In fact, one of his students would be the famed 1940s, 50s, 60s American painter Jackson Pollock, who we'll talk about later as depicting 1950s as being a very chaotic decade. By 1930, Jose Clemente Orozco would be invited to paint a mural at Pomona College in Claremont, California, marking the arrival of Mexican muralism to the United States. I love the mural on the screen right now, the trench. You can see why the Mexican government did not like him. He begins to critique the outcomes of the Mexican Revolution. And of course, the same year, Diego Rivera will also join the three artists in the United States. He will gain commissions throughout the country to paint murals the country over, including a very famous one depicted on the bottom right, History of the Working Class in Detroit. But the arrival of these artists created a sensation in American art. And the murals themselves quickly became a form of public art in the United States. But notice the paintings of Diego Rivera on the screen. He's depicting both a Mexican-American working class. Look at the bottom right, which is, again, titled History of the Working Class. But look at it. Look at the workers themselves. They're white. They're black. They're brown. They're every shade in between, toiling together in the factories of Detroit. Look at the top one, Pan-American Unity. Again, white, black, brown, Indian, coming together for a common cause of a common shared history. This represents resistance. This represents protest. This represents trying to make things better for the working class. And these are huge. The one in Detroit is a room that is 30 or 40 feet long by 30 or 40 feet high. This is a huge mural. But despite the Mexican muralism's socialist and revolution depictions, many of these artists involved in the movement later become fascinated with the capitalist industrial innovations demonstrated by people like Henry Ford in the United States. Most notably, Rivera will make a series of murals in Detroit depicting men working in harmony with the machines. Others, such as Sequeiros, began to see these innovations as a double-edged sword. So while Sequeiros remains fascinated by industry, he also paints a mural for the Electrical Workers Union, depicting the machine of war causing death and destruction against the workers themselves. Another main feature of these murals was religion, of course. Here's a very famous one of Diego Rivera called Creation. And again, the main religion of Mexico, no surprise, is Catholicism. It was brought in as part of the Spanish rule over the country. However, it was a form of Catholicism that incorporated imagery and rituals of indigenous Mexican religions. For many Mexican muralists, including Diego Rivera, it was this combination of Western and native religious rites that was something that made Mexican identity unique, and explored this in several of his works. But they didn't always treat religion the same way. Take the one on the screen, Creation, 1922, depicting different forms of religious integration. Rivera's mural suggests a mystical approach to assimilating Western religious imagery while portraying native Mexicans as Adam and Eve. So dark-skinned, brown-skinned, much like La Virgen was as well. So we see this new era of art that begins to not only be in Mexico, but cross into the United States as well. We also have this era, not only this new artwork coming in that is changing the face of how we view things, solidarity for the working class, unionization efforts. We also see the new woman as well. Now, traditionally, again, U.S. history courses focus on the flapper, because as you see in the screen, women underwent dramatic changes during the 1920s. For example, in 1919, women's skirts were typically about 6 inches off the ground. By 1927, that same skirt was now at the knees. This is a big change. This is a dramatic change in how much leg women are showing. And yes, I know it seems silly now, but we still have dress rules in high schools, right? Where they must be basically the skirt or leg must be at your knees. Otherwise, you're showing too much leg. This all began in the 1920s. And these new women were known as flappers. So named after a British fad that allowed their galoshes, their shoes, to flap around their ankles. The flapper, wearing short skirts, bobbed their hair, listening to jazz, smoked, and drank bootlegged gin. Flappers were a global phenomenon, exported from the United States by popular entertainment and advertising. They were considered by the older generations, the politicians, the clergy, and the moral police as evildoers, as corrupt, as being too flirtatious, as too risky or too risque, as too flamboyant. They were criticized, they were condemned, they were attacked, they were called loose or worse. For flapper women, though, they were none of these things. They were cultural warriors who did not accept the prescribed definitions of what woman was supposed to be, according to their societal overlords. Rather, they wanted to make their own definition of woman. They were unapologetic as they took on the persona of men. They smoked. Yeah, they did. They drank. Oh, yeah, they did. They danced. They dressed sexy. They had sex in those new things called cars. They were proud of their bodies, and they used their bodies from a position of power. But even in the United States, this was not exclusively for just Anglo-Americans. Many Latinas also took on this new image and were proud of it. Hispanic American version of the flapper was called La Pelona, the short-haired girl. You see, for all these migrants and these Mexican Americans who came to escape the violence of the revolution, their children were now becoming teenagers in the United States, and they began to inhabit and exhibit their new Mexican Americanness. Again, as Chicano historian George Sanchez illustrated, regarding the movies, the plots stress the commonality of all Americans. The children of Mexican immigrants were especially intrigued by the open sexuality depicted on the screen. The collective experience of sitting alone in a darkened theater, they begin to identify with the on-screen characters, and they begin to feel quite liberated by this. However, flapperissimo, or flapperdom, was no more appreciated by the Hispanic guardians of traditional femininity than it was by the Anglo-American ones. The flapper, la pelona, were seen as both threats to traditional family values and to the larger Anglo community. For the conservative Hispanic, males mostly, but not exclusively. These family values included a sense of loyalty to the Hispanic culture. Pelonas were also vendidas. They were sellouts to Anglo-American culture. Hispanic pelonas became symbols of undignified acculturation, ethnic disloyalty. As journalist Julio Arce, he carried on a crusade against these women. He published his work in the Spanish language newspaper in San Francisco, La Crónica. He described as one of the leading conservative intellectuals of the imagined community of Mexican colony outside of Mexico. Arce portrayed pelonas as flirty, as mercenary, as exhibitionist. He said their biggest fault was their anti-domesticity. Flaperismo conflicted with the, quote, expected domesticity and modesty for women, unquote. In his satirical cartoons, he predicted the inevitable effects of flaperismo on men. That is, that men would lose their physical and sexual dominance over women. Arce represents her, La Pelona, as a modern engulfing force that disrupted Hispanic tradition. So yeah, they were seen as outlaws among their own people. They were seen as betrayers of Mexican heritage, as becoming too American, as becoming Mexican American, as becoming, well, betraying the family. And this was under attack not only from the Anglo community, who saw them as potential deviants, but as betrayers of the Mexicano community. Please, whether Anglo or Mexicana, no matter how they were viewed, these Mexicanos looked at these cultural trends, the new woman, the cars, the music, the dance clubs, and became much more open, often without having chaperones any longer. They began to engage more freely in sex. And they were able to, because of the first time in history, these were the beginnings of a sexual liberation, in part due to the culture, and in part because of other people like Margaret Sanger. And again, this is important to understand the 1920s and to understand what we'll talk about in our next lecture. Margaret Sanger, on October 16th, 1916, she opened her very first, what was called the FPC, the Family Planning Clinic, in Brooklyn, New York. Now, it was raided just 9 days later, and she was given 30 days in jail. But her arrest gave publicity to her cause, and the actions were overturned on appeals. In other words, doctors, thanks to Margaret Sanger, in large part because of Margaret Sanger, were now able to prescribe birth control pills. This also came along with the idea of sexual freedom or sexual liberation in the 1920s, along with the cars and the music and the dance floors. Now you also have birth control. In 1921, Sanger found the ABCL, the American Birth Control League, which would allow her to open the first legal birth control clinic, staffed entirely by female doctors and social workers. The first legal birth control clinic in the United States. And of course, these family planning clinics under the American Birth Control League would expand across the United States, becoming eventually Planned Parenthood. Now, to be clear, there is a problematic side of Margaret Sanger. She was a eugenicist. She was involved in the eugenics movement, something we'll talk about next time in much more detail. She would endorse sterilization of the mentally incompetent and those with hereditary diseases. She did not advocate for genocide or mass sterilization against any ethnic group, including Mexicanos or African Americans, but she has issues. I bring her up now because I want you to understand she's vital to understanding the 1920s sexual liberation movement here. And again, this is being embraced by both Anglo-Americans and, of course, Mexicanos, and of course, Mexicanas, the new Latina. All these things overlap with the flapper. All these things overlap with the car, the consumerism, the dance clubs, the jazz, the art, and all these new ideas of freedom all coalesce in the Roaring '20s as they are able to get away from the chaperonage of their parents. They change into sexier clothing. They smoke, they drink, they party, they club, they dance, they have sex and make out mountain. Their bodies and bodily comportment mixed with other genders and ethno races on the dance floor that offended their parents' generation. It should come as no surprise then that all these things, all these Roaring '20s things that we talk about, will face a massive resistance from the more conservative and more traditional parent generation. But that's a topic for next time. So until then, take care and bye-bye.